to all of you. Welcome again to this webinar on concept maps, a learning and assessment super tool. I am Christine Hadid, marketing strategist for Sero Learning Assessments. I am also a community organizer and former classroom teacher, and I am excited to share with you some of what I know about concept mapping, along with my co-host, Brian Moon, who is the expert here, and he is the president and founder of Sero Learning Assessments, and also the co-author of Applied Concept Mapping, Capturing, Analyzing, and Organizing Knowledge with Joe Novak, who you'll meet a little later in this presentation. So we're very excited to have all of you here. Thank you for taking time out of your afternoon to learn a little bit about concept mapping, and we hope that we can share with you some valuable information to bring back to your organizations. And moving on to the next slide, you are in the right place if you are an educator seeking more effective ways to engage students' higher order thinking skills. If you're a school administrator or policymaker looking for evidence-based alternatives to standardized multiple choice tests. If you're a trainer or human resources professional who wants better ways to assess and cultivate cognitive skills in the workplace. You may be an executive who needs solutions to harness employee expertise for better teamwork and innovation, or even a creator, innovator, or entrepreneur who loves finding learning hacks to accelerate personal growth and product development. Concept maps can be used for all of these purposes. And move on to the next slide. So people in those categories have used concept maps to achieve extraordinary results, and our hope is that you will be able to do the same with what the tools that we provide in this webinar. And so just a little roadmap for the structure of this webinar and the contents that we have planned ahead. We are going to first be covering why concept maps are a great learning and assessment tool. And then we're going to explore what distinguishes them from mind maps, which you may also be somewhat familiar with. Next, we're going to explore how to create good concept maps. And then lastly, we're going to explore a little bit deeper how you can leverage concept mapping in a learning environment.
Come here.
And before we get started, if everyone could just make sure that you're on mute. I think there might be a way that I can do that as well as host. Brian, are you familiar where I would go to do that to mute everyone?
Go to participants, and then at the bottom of the list, you'll see a mute all.
Let's see.
Yep, everybody's muted, so go ahead.
Okay. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so first we are going to discuss why are concept maps a great learning and assessment tool. And just to share some background, in the early 1970s, educator, scientist, and researcher Joe Novak and his team at Cornell developed concept mapping to enable meaningful learning and assessment of elementary level science students. And as I mentioned before, Sero's founder, Brian Moon, actually co-wrote a book with Joe Novak. Since Joe Novak pioneered the idea and practice of concept mapping, hundreds of studies conducted around the globe have demonstrated the cognitive usefulness of this practice. Concept maps portray mental models using meaningful diagrams of knowledge. That is the in a nutshell definition, but let's break down exactly what that means. So first, mental models. Let's go into exactly what that is. Earlier, we said, so our internal mental models help us predict outcomes and drive our decision making. Mental models have been getting a lot of buzz particularly lately, because they can reveal experts' decision-making strategies. If you're active on Twitter or LinkedIn, you might see people sharing mental models that they've learned about from their favorite business leaders on how to make different decisions. But in short, mental models are the cognitive connections we form in our minds to help us make sense of the world. And mental models are invisible and internal, but they can be represented visually. So in essence, they're like taking a peek inside someone's mind. And a concept map is a visual representation of one of these mental models. So at a glance, a concept map can reveal, for example, what a student knows about a certain topic, a customer's perception of a product or service, how an expert views a certain kind of problem, different team members thinking about a shared goal or challenge, and more. Above and beyond their value for expressing mental models in this way, concept maps are also powerful learning and assessment tools. They can be used to pinpoint misconceptions and improve intellectual collaboration and better understand how others see the world. This further accelerates their value for learning as a tool that seamlessly facilitates both learner cognition and educator feedback. And so let's move on. And to break down the concept of meaningful learning, some of you may already be familiar with this. I'm sure you are. But for those who need a refresher, meaningful learning assimilates new information within the context of known information. So relating to a learner's prior knowledge is what makes new knowledge relevant or meaningful to a learner. And let's break down even a little bit more of what we mean by that. So to contrast the difference between rote and meaningful learning, meaningful learning contrasts with rote learning, which is generally consists of memorizing information as isolated units. So for instance, a rote learning exercise might involve memorizing the outcome of certain landmark Supreme Court verdicts. On the other hand, a meaningful learning exercise might involve connecting the outcome of Supreme Court cases in the past to other policies and events today. So while rote learning focuses on recalling facts, meaningful learning focuses on understanding how different aspects of the world relate to and affect each other. And just as a side note, rote learning is not fundamentally bad, and memorization is Oh, sorry, Raphael, do you mind muting yourself? Thank you. Rote learning is not fundamentally bad, and memorization can be a useful skill in many contexts. However, many educators and education advocates have raised concerns that our current system overemphasizes rote learning to the detriment of meaningful learning and critical thinking. So when we talk about meaningful learning, this is an example of the difference between the rote learning paradigm. And moving on to the next slide. So concept mapping is meaningful mental modeling, and it can help individuals visualize their own mental models and view representations of others' mental models. It helps understand meaningful connections between different concepts. It activates metacognitive awareness of one's own internal thought processes, and helps learners holistically comprehend the big picture of what they're learning. The process of concept mapping is in and of itself a powerful cognitive process. However, once a mental model has been visualized as a concept map, it can then be used for even greater purposes. And let's move on to the next slide. So before we get into the meat of concept mapping and how to create it, we wanted to just give a brief note on what distinguishes concept maps from mind maps, because in our experience, the two are often confused. And on the next slide, we'll show a visualization of the differences. So concept maps and mind maps are not the same. Mind maps suggest general relationships between various concepts by using labeled boxes or circles connected by linking lines, as you can see on the slide. On the other hand, concept maps indicate specific relationships between relevant concepts using structured statements called propositions. By relying on more clear and precise relationships between concepts, concept maps convey more accurate, meaningful, and insightful information compared to mind maps. So this is a critical difference. That specificity creates a knowledge structure that is more representative of a mental model, whereas mind maps are a lot more vague in their connections and are often used for brainstorming purposes, but they are not necessarily knowledge structures in the same way that concept maps are. And so now that we've covered that point, let's get into how to build a good concept map. So there are two main features of a concept map that we're going to review today. The first one are focus questions, and the second is propositions. So first, the importance of focus questions. Everything in the universe is related to some degree. So without constraints, concept maps can become infinitely large and complex. Focus questions are important because they help establish context and boundaries for what information a concept map should, and almost more importantly, what it should not include. And so moving on to the next slide, let's review the difference between a static versus a dynamic focus question. And this is a really interesting distinction, in my opinion. So research has shown that different focus questions can actually inspire different concept map structures, even within the same subject. Consider the differences between the following questions. The first question is, what are the parts of the solar system? The second question is, how do parts of the solar system affect life on Earth? The first question is static and will most likely elicit definition-based relationships between concepts. The second question is dynamic and more likely to elicit a structure that shows the systemic nature of how concepts are related. And obviously, we're kind of more interested in the dynamic questions because they show a systemic, holistic understanding of how different concepts actually affect each other, not just exactly what they are and the definitions behind them. So when it comes to fostering more critical thinking and engagement, dynamic focus questions tend to be preferable. And let's move on to the next slide. So we just reviewed focus questions are the first important elements of concept maps. The second is propositions. And so let's quickly review the anatomy of a proposition, which is essentially the building block of concept maps. So a proposition consists of a concept, a linking phrase, and a concept. Just as sentences are the building blocks of essays, these propositions are the building blocks of concept maps. And the propositions contain two concepts connected by one verb-like linking phrase that describes the relationship between them. So for example, here we have the earth is the first concept, revolves around is the linking phrase, and the sun is the second concept. Notice that the second linking line contains an arrow to show the order in which the proposition should be read. And this is essential because when read in order, each proposition should be a coherent and independent statement about the world. If the arrow pointing towards the sun was not there, we wouldn't necessarily know the order that the statement should be read. And read in reverse, if we said the sun revolves around the earth, that is not a valid statement. So those directional arrows are very important to add more specificity and clarity to the nature of the relationship that a proposition suggests. And let's move on to the next slide. So here, I'm going to ask for your help and engagement as we kind of practice how to complete the following propositions. So you can respond in the chat with what you would put in the blanks. And first, I'm going to ask what you think is the relationship between poverty and literacy rates. So what linking phrase would accurately describe that relationship of how poverty and literacy rates are correlated? And I'm going to ask if you can just put in the chat what you think. We'll get a few suggestions.
And be sure to add the arrowhead to let us know which way you think it should be read.
So Libby thinks poverty increases. So I'm assuming the arrow would be pointed towards literacy rates, or is it the opposite way? Do literacy rates increase poverty? Poverty, Ramon says, or Leanne says poverty is correlated with literacy rates. Ramon says poverty influences literacy rates. Tanya got a little bit more specific and has the directional arrow pointed towards literacy rates and says poverty contributes to lower literacy rates. Joe Ellen says poverty is positively correlated with higher literacy rates. Janet says she thinks it should be a double-ended arrow to show, I'm assuming, how both poverty can affect literacy rates, but also literacy rates can affect poverty. And Christopher said, not to be that guy, but doesn't the direction of the arrow have a lot to do with the focus question? Is the concept map about literacy rates or poverty? What would you say to that, Brian?
Well, I think Chris is right in the fact that we would do well to have a focus question to get people focused on the relationship in a way that fits the context to answer the focus question. So Chris, thanks for being that guy.
And so the points of this exercise, and no one is necessarily right or wrong, but the points of this is that in a learning environment, it can foster exactly these types of conversations that have nuance and probing questions like this. And in a classroom setting, it is going to force learners to really examine the relationship between these concepts and hear what other people's opinions are about the relationship between these concepts. And we're going to kind of facilitate a similar activity like that in just a moment. For the next proposition, I want you to consider how concept mapping might relate to your work. So I know a lot of you are involved in education or training or certification. How would concept maps specifically relate to your work, and how would your work potentially, if you read it in the other direction, affect concept mapping? Yana says, my work implements concept mapping. So, and our hope is that many of you will be able to see a connection between how concept mapping could aid your work. But at this point, we'll go to the next slide. And I'm going to pass it off to Brian here to get a little bit of practice and see an example of what it looks like to build a concept map in Sero, which is the tool that our tool of choice, which has a lot of different capabilities that we'll get into further. But Brian is going to share his screen now, and using the example that we just looked at, showing the relationship between poverty and literacy rates, we're going to look at how that could fit into a concept map with a related focus question.
All right, thanks, Christine. So what I'm going to do is sort of walk everybody through building out a concept map using some of the content that you all provided. To Chris's point, which was a great one, those relationships and the direction of those arrowheads is always going to depend on the context of the map, which is provided in the focus question. If we might consider a focus question, how does education affect quality of life? And we could build out the smaller part about the quality of life and then the poverty and literacy rates. What we are doing in Sero then is enabling people to build out concept maps for the express purpose of doing learning assessment. So this is our tool, Sero. I will walk through just a bit of Sero. We certainly welcome everybody to follow up with us afterward if you'd like to see a deeper demonstration. But today, for the purpose of just showing you how concept maps are built, particularly within the context of Sero. So we have here concepts. Those are going to be in the darker boxes, and then they are connected, as Christine said, explicitly by those linking phrases. And then the arrowhead's going to point to the concluding concept in order to show which direction that proposition should be read. I saw a couple folks suggested double-ended arrows, and those can be useful, but we think a better practice to use the concept map connections, the arrowheads, in ways that are explicit to talk about that relationship. So many of you offered, influences or effects. As a concept mapping coach, I might suggest that we try to get even more specific in the context of this map. So if we were going to make some of those connections, we would go from poverty, for instance, to literacy rates, and look at the screen here, and we could say something like effects, and we create that link. So concept mapping is really about generating these concepts. We can have these concepts say whatever we want them to say. Generally, we suggest that they are succinct and as short as possible in order to get across what that concept is intended to state. Same thing also for the linking phrases. They should be as concise as possible and as explicit and specific as possible to show what that relationship is. We could have these going in different directions. So poverty rates could affect literacy rates. Just to show you how the actual mechanism work, does not affect. So rather than that double-ended, we might suggest that we have two connections that, again, provide a more specific view on the particular relationships between those concepts. And building out concept maps in Sero is fairly easy to do. You can, of course, delete things. You can use these linking phrases elsewhere if you want to use them. That is essentially the process. It's at the same time pretty simple, but it's also very complex when we start thinking about all the different concepts we might include. We start thinking about the linking phrases we can and should include. We start thinking about which concepts we should not include because they're not relevant to our focus question. And so it's an iterative process of starting with that focus question, thinking about some starting concepts, bringing those into the map, starting to organize them in a semi-hierarchy. It doesn't have to be in a specific hierarchy, but it can be a semi-hierarchy. And by that, I mean, we can also link across the map to create connections, what we call cross links. These are particularly important in concept mapping because they show, even more detailed knowledge about different areas of knowledge and how those relate to each other. So we're always looking for those cross links. Here's another example. We create the focus question. We build out some concepts. We start to organize them hierarchically. We then start to add those links. and then we iterate. So we're adding new concepts, new connections, new links as we go. And the maps, as Christine said, they can get fairly large. They are only limited by the imagination of the authors and the focus question, which should provide the context. So that's a basic introduction to building out concept maps. And in Sero, this process for people who are doing instruction and assessment is the first stage in building out the assessment. So we build out this concept map as a reference map or a master map against which student work is going to be compared. And as you see on our workflow over here, we get the map set up in terms of the focus question, we build out the content of the map, and then we move on to the following stages, which is to build an assessment from this master or reference map. So I'm going to leave it there, turn it back to Christine, and continue with the presentation.
All right, and so thanks, Brian. So that was just a very brief taster of one concept mapping exercise. So what Brian just showed, and Brian, feel free to jump in to add or correct, but the exercise that we were just demonstrating could be used for diagnostic purposes to see the kind of map a learner or trainee would build from scratch based on a focus question, just to kind of understand what their baseline understanding of a topic is. It could also be used as a collaborative exercise. So we call that, a collective concept map building, where you're really drawing on the prior knowledge or expertise of a group to create a structure of knowledge that represents how everyone is kind of thinking and synthesize those different perspectives. And even though in those diagnostic kind of collective exercises, I would say that the focus is not as much on assessing whether a proposition is valid or invalid, but just to kind of understand what people are thinking. However, there are obviously valid and invalid propositions and statements as well. And so if you're building a concept map based on content that has already been taught, you can also use a map for studying or for assessment. So students can create concept maps either from scratch or by filling in a scaffolded map, and then compare their understanding to what we call master maps, which are constructs of knowledge created by an expert, whether that's a teacher or someone who has specialized knowledge in a field. And in those cases, it's less about synthesizing and brainstorming from scratch and more about having learners compare their own mental models to the mental model of an expert. Would you say that all of that was more or less accurate, Brian, how I explained it?
Yeah, that's good. Again, there are lots of different ways concept mapping can be used in learning environments. And it really does depend on the focus of your particular need at any given time. There are a number of ways to implement both Sero, our tool, and also just concept mapping generally. It's been around for 50 years. Initially, folks were transcribing interviews in the form of concept maps to better pull out those mental models. We moved on to creating concept maps on whiteboards and even using pencils and string and paper. And of course, more recently, in the past couple of decades, building these digital tools to support the process. It all comes down to those basic components that Christine described. What is the focus question? What do you want that mental model to try to elicit? And then building out those propositions. And again, you may have students develop them. You may have the master map built against content or the expert mental model, and you might want to compare the students to that. It really does depend on what your intent is in using them as a learning and or assessment tool. The intent really drives the implementation.
And so this is just kind of a very cursory introduction. Our purpose with this webinar is just to kind of expose you to what is possible with concept maps. There's a lot more in-depth training that we could do and instruction that we could give. And for those of you who are interested in that, we'd love for you to reach out to us so we can get an idea of what kind of content we can create or offer to help you in that journey. From the previous slide, we also have a resource that you can reference that I'm going to share in the chat real quick. That's on our website if you want to see a little bit more of a step-by-step process for how to use concept mapping for one of those purposes. And let me just copy and paste the link here.
Yeah, while Christine's doing that, let me talk a bit more about concept map-based assessment. And I jumped the gun a little bit, but what I wanted to show was this idea. So again, the implementation depends on your intention, but the spectrum, if you will, of what kind of tasks could be provided to a learner, how they might be analyzed, and then what the sort of setup and execution of the assessment task is, you can think of it kind of as an end-to-end spectrum, or as we're showing here, a matrix. So if you think about concept maps having content being those propositions, and then also having structure, meaning, you know, the map and the structure itself, you can sort of think in the lower left, everything from a complete blank structure where the students are providing all of the content. So in that case, the task might look like teaching students how to do concept mapping, giving them the focus question, and providing no additional content or structure, and then having the student build out their own map. That is a tremendously useful thing to do, particularly if that upfront piece of training the students how to develop concept mapping has been done. If it hasn't been done, it needs to be done. There's a lot of studies in the concept mapping literature about that need to really scaffold the learners about what a good concept map looks like, how to go through those steps that I talked about earlier, how to give students confidence in the size of their map and the content of their map. So there's a significant level of instruction that needs to be provided about concept mapping as a task. But if that has been done, again, either in a software tool or on a whiteboard or individually or collectively, students can create their own concept maps. From an instructional perspective, that lower left quadrant, however, while it does provide a lot of insight into how the students are thinking, it's very hard, particularly in today's learning environments with many students, to evaluate those, to see trends across students, to see gaps in learning. And so it really does require the instructor to go through each map and look at them individually. And ideally, so that the student gets the most learning advantage, to give each student feedback. In the upper right quadrant then, and many of you have probably seen these kinds of examples in bubble maps, for instance, where most of the content and most of the structure is provided. And so, again, that type of approach has a place. It has a place. We don't often recommend it as an approach, because it's that sort of, provided content, provided structure that we think is over-reliant, right? It's used way too often. So multiple choice tests, for instance, provide all of the content and all of the structure of the task. Bubble maps or fill-in maps or that sort of thing that are often printed off and handed to students. Again, they're going to provide a lot of the content and the structure. What is good about those approaches is that they are easy to evaluate. Right, you have a master map, you can quickly score. If a score is your desire, you can quickly score all of those maps against the reference map. So if we think again of this as sort of a matrix, what we're actually suggesting folks do is look sort of in the gray area. Are there tasks you can create where you might provide some content, but not all the content? You might provide some structure, but not all the structure. And so in particular, what we try to do with Sero is think about a blank sheet and then a complete concept map. And where is that sort of play area in the middle that you can create tasks around, again, depending on your assessment focus, where you can create tasks around giving some structure, giving some content, but also using approaches such as just the concept map building process, or approaches such as even multiple choice item types, where you're not going to give the student the content, but you might give them options to choose from to fill in that content. And so that's what we do with Sero. We take those master maps and we turn them into assessments that play sort of in this gray area. If you're trying to do formative assessment for the purposes of learning, providing some content and maybe less structure is a way to go about it. If you are wanting to do more of a summative assessment, as Christine suggested, after content has been provided, you want to see if there's good comprehension or where those learning gaps still exist, you might build out a summative type concept map. And so we have a couple of different formats that we use in Sero to achieve the gray area, to allow assessors and instructors to figure out how they want to present the task, and then providing the authoring support and the assessing, the evaluation, the scoring piece as well, to be able to look across a lot of maps and see where those gaps still exist. So just wanted to, again, as Christine suggested, give you just a flavor of what we're doing with Sero. But I think understanding sort of this matrix in terms of building the task and thinking about how you're going to evaluate the student work is really important when you're thinking about this sort of thing.
And so on this slide, here's some screenshots of Sero's capabilities for turning concept maps into assessments that can be easily analyzed, and where feedback can be easily given to both the learner and the educator. As Brian said, a big part of our goal with Sero is to take those really powerful, deep cognitive benefits and insights that concept maps can reveal, but to make the use of that more efficient in a classroom setting. Because any of you who are teachers who have, 20 plus students, we know there are so many ways that you can engage students to really get insight into their thinking on a personalized level, but often they are time consuming both to design and to evaluate and to provide data on. And so Sero has some really cutting edge authoring, customization, and analytic tools embedded into the software that we hope will make it easier for educators to get those cognitive benefits of concept mapping in a way that is simpler, speedier, and more scalable. And best of all, Sero is free, at least for now, and for the foreseeable future for everyone who is on this webinar. If you go to our website, serolearn.com, you have free access to Sero. You can create an account and explore our learning journey resources to get more oriented to the practice of concept mapping. There are resources to help your learners get oriented to concept mapping and practice that skill. And also you can even get paid to join our pilot program. We are really passionate about the potential of concept mapping to increase cognition and provide deeper assessment opportunities. And so we would love to have the opportunity to work with you if you're interested in implementing this kind of practice in your organization. We will directly support and offer instructional guidance for how you can get that set up using the Sero software. So if that is something that you are interested in, you can apply for our pilot program on our website, and I will post that link in the chat as well. If not, we we still encourage you to create a free account and practice to see if Sero and concept mapping, using whatever tool you like, but obviously we are really proud of the tool that we've created, and see if it's something that can benefit your organization and your students or learners or trainees.
I am answering a few of the questions, so keep the questions coming. I will type them in here, but I'll also answer them as we go. So there's one question about IT and what sort of questions they might have. Leanne asked that question. Leanne, the short answer is we've been through the HVAC process at the University of Texas, so we do have the paperwork trail to provide that. Chris has asked if you have existing maps and CMAP tools, you can, well, he's not asking, he's telling everyone because he's already used it. Yeah, so CMAP tools, maps, the .cmap files that you folks might be used to can be directly imported into Sero. So you could take any master map that you already have and bring it in and start your assessment from there. Janet's asking how much training will we need to provide our students before Sero could be useful? That's a great question, Janet. And one of the key advantages we think to our approach actually is that you can create a learning pathway in Sero pretty easily that actually brings students along the concept mapping pathway. So for instance, very structured exercises that you can do in Sero. These can be, smaller maps. We do again have two different approaches, and just to summarize them, the approaches are what we call a skeleton map, which provides some content and structure, and then the students are going to fill that in or select content or make those connections or try to find errors. There's lots of different item types that we have. Our second approach is called build a map, which is giving the students just the concepts and linking phrases and having them build their own maps. So those exercises in and of themselves already start to structure the concept mapping learning process, learning about concept maps and how to do concept mapping. And so in terms of how long, how much, we have spent a lot of time and effort in making sure that the experience of the students is straightforward. There's video help, there's in-app help along the way that shows the students just how to do it. Apollo's asking about images. We are the current version that folks can use publicly does not use images. We really want to focus for now on building the structure around the assessment process. So I can tell you, I can tell everybody in this webinar, we are able to use images, and we'll make that feature available very soon. Yana's asking any link I can refer to import existing map into Sero. You do that actually, Yana, in the context of Sero. So I'd invite everybody to register for Sero, go in, take a look at the application. Again, we've got structured materials to talk more about how it works and how you can use it. But both Christine and I invite everybody to reach out to us with questions. Yana is asking, can mathematical equations be added into Sero? Similar answer to the images question. We can do that sort of thing. And if that's something that folks are really eager to take to make use of, then those are features that we can also provide. We have them. It's just we've been focused elsewhere lately in terms of development, but it's super helpful to us to have folks ask if these kinds of features can be available, because that can help us drive our development too. And that's really the kind of relationship we're looking for, especially with folks on this webinar, is a mutual learning environment where we can learn more about what you need, and you can learn more about how we've built out Sero, and hopefully we're pretty confident that the features and functions we already have available are super useful. And we'd like to hear from you all if that is true, but also to get that feedback in terms of how useful they are and what else would be useful. Apollo has asked, we have case study of CMAPs applied to different industries. Shameless plug, Apollo. I guess I'd point you to the book Applied Concept Mapping, which has lots and lots of different case studies of CMAPs in different industries. And we solicited those from concept mappers all around the world. So take a look at that book or reach out directly. We can point you in other directions as well. Joellen's asking, can you cut and paste from a Word document? There's a couple ways to answer that question, Joellen. If you're thinking about copying from a Word document directly into one of those concepts, yes, that will work. If you get into more complex, equations and that sort of thing, it should work for most cases. We'd love to have you try it and let us know which cases are not working, so that we can get that feedback and then do some more development. I should say, I know we've got folks from outside the US on the call. We are able to, you are able to create concept maps in other languages. The interface itself is only available in English, which would be also for your students, but you can actually create concept maps in other languages. So Ramon gets to a key point and advantage of Sero. Yes, Ramon, you're correct. Grading concept maps can be very time consuming to teachers, and frankly is the primary reason why concept maps aren't used more widely. It is an automated process with us. And so again, if you have the reference map, we are able to compare all the student work against the reference map. If you want the students to create their own maps, we still make it fairly easy for you to get through each map, if that's how you'd like to do it, to see all the students' work. But again, starting with that reference map does enable us to automatically and instantly score any map. So Ramon, if you'd like to hear more about how we're doing that, again, feel free to follow up after the webinar and we can walk you through more detail. I think that's all the questions. I'll keep watching for other questions, but turn it back over to Christine to wrap up.
Yep, so we are about through an hour, just about 10 minutes shy. And I think this is a good point to kind of close out unless anyone has any other questions. Again, thank you all for attending. We hope that you're a little bit more excited about concept maps and have kind of a vision of how you could possibly implement them in your classroom or organization. If you'd like to explore deeper, there's so much more that we can do. And again, we'd love if you're interested in that to reach out to us or apply to our pilot program. Just a little side note, pretty much anyone who's really excited about concept mapping will be accepted to the pilot program at this point. So if that's something you're interested in, we encourage you to do that. And also we invite you to connect with us on Twitter and LinkedIn. When you registered for the webinar, I believe many of you provided a LinkedIn URL, so we'll also be following up with you that way to stay in touch. And thank you again just for joining and taking this time to learn more about concept mapping and Sero.